Okay, I'm recording. This is the Rob Kall Bottom-Up Show. I usually say radio show, but we're trying video this time first. And I'm fortunate to have Leigh Clarke, who is a real expert at doing video things like this, so she's helping me. So thanks, Laura.
No problem.
We also have Tom Chi, and let me introduce you and we'll get started on the conversation. Okay, so Leigh Clarke is the creator of storytelling for social profit. Tom Chi was one of the founding members of the founding team of Google X, which has done all kinds of amazing and interesting things, and hopefully Tom will tell us a little bit about that. And he's worked with hundreds of teams working for social good throughout the world. We're here to have a conversation about storytelling for social profit. I've been interviewed as a part of this project, and in being interviewed by Laura, it made me think that what she's doing and her project is worth hearing about, because it's all about helping people to use their writing and their storytelling to help make the world a better place. Right?
Absolutely.
Right.
I think storytellers have this amazing power in their hands, and with some insights and stuff that Tom might share with us, I think we can make it even more powerful.
So tell us a little bit about this project.
Well, it came about during the last conference that we put on, and it was in the mythology class. So you may remember that the Orlando atrocity happened with the shooting, and we were just stunned and shocked. And it was right in the middle of the conference over the weekend, I think. And we came back to the classes, and no one could really absorb how that could happen. And so one of the natural questions that came up was, how does this happen? What is it in our mythologies that create this? And Pamela J. Smith, who was the mythology teacher, kind of said something rather profound. She said that the mythologies that a civilization is built on will dictate the values that the culture will have, and what they allow and disallow, and what becomes normal. And she then went on to say, well, of course, America was founded on the mythology of the Wild, Wild West. And that was like, wow, wisdom bomb. But just thinking about that, I started to think that, well, okay, so to change this, yeah, real change needs to happen. But at the same time, if we change the stories, and where are our stories? They're on TV, they're on Netflix, they're on our movies, they're in the novels that we read. And so they infiltrate our consciousness already. So if we were to empower the writers who are writing these kind of things, and strangely enough, those were the guys that we were talking to there and then we've got a real chance of shifting mindsets, but in a very kind of subtle but entertaining way, where we're not having to go out and go up against, like gun laws and stuff like that. We can do it through story instead.
Okay, so you've invited Tom Chi to be part of this conversation,
Right.
And he's a part of your team. Why?
Why? Because he's a genius. So he doesn't like the word genius. So the reason being is that we've had extensive conversations about a lot of the work that Tom does, and Tom has the insight into what are the real things that need to happen on a tangible level. What are the tipping points that we can affect, and where are our resources best put in order to create actual change? Like he mentioned healthcare earlier, and making that accessible and so on. And so we've put together a think tank, and Tom is one of the members of the think tank. We've got John Truby, who is a story guru, and Pamela J. Smith, who is the mythologist that was in on that original realization. And together, later on in after the main summit, these guys are going to kind of put together all of the things that the experts have contributed, of which you were one, Rob, very kindly. And we're going to discuss those issues and find out, well, what are the things that are easy to storify? How do we make them into stories? How do we weave them into scripts without those scripts being very on the nose or preachy? And then Tom's also going to be there to kind of guide us in terms of, like, that's not realistic, or a better way to do it would be X, Y, Z.
So what are some of those tipping point opportunities, Tom?
I think there is a tendency to go take whatever is happening right now and just take it to the nth degree as our prediction of what the future is going to be like. And as a short aside, like when I was in school, I was one of the editors of this magazine called the Cornell Science and Technology magazine, which sounds like whatever, but it had actually been published continuously since 1880. So we had a rack of magazines from, dating back to the late 1800s inside of our office. And sometimes I would like take them out and flip through them. And you could almost see, and it started, back in the 1880s, like a lot of it was agriculture, the beginning of like motorized farm equipment and all that sort of thing. But as you started to flip through, every age predicted that everything was going to be about the discovery that they just had. So as soon as radioactivity was discovered, the ads in the back of the magazine where it's like, take this pill, this radioactivity will make you healthy. Everything is going to be, powered by the atom, and so on and so forth. We start, firing rockets into space, everything's going to be rocket powered. And right now we're in this particular age where we really like our computers, and we really think that everything about the future is going to be about our latest, technological fetish. And I would say, being able to scan over 100 years of that gives you some perspective that, yeah, that's pretty far off. So when I try to go think about, because we don't have cities that are floating on rockets, people don't eat radium every day in order to stay healthy. It's not that radioactivity or rocket science or whatever hasn't affected the world in any way, but it's always in the appropriate proportion, and like the energy of that fad goes away over time. Right now we're in a fad around data and artificial intelligence, and there will be a proportion that's valuable. Now the grounding cord to what will actually need to happen in the world is really just the physical possibilities of the world. And that sounds like really, basic and obvious, but I think that society overall has lost touch with it, right? There's the sensibility that if you have enough money or you have enough resources, then anything is possible for you. But in truth, if you were to trace back even, the food that you ate today, you required the labor of both the earth and of thousands of people for the food that you're eating today to be able to enter your mouth. And I think the place that we're going to need to go in terms of the grounding cord is going to be this reconnection to the actual true cycles of the movement of energy around our ecosystem and the planet. Because right now it's insanely imbalanced, and basically there isn't a condition where humanity lasts very much longer in the absence of bringing that back into balance. And there's a lot more to say about that, because there's lots of parts to bringing it back into balance. But that's the grounding cord. It's not artificial intelligence, nor is it eating radium.
Well, let's go to one of the phrases that you've used a couple times, grounding cord.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
So there is imagination and there is grounding. And imagination is great because let's say you had 3 things, and then your imagination will allow you to imagine, a number of ways that you might combine 3 different things. And actually, as you expand the number of things that you have under consideration, you can imagine nearly infinite combinations of those things. Now, in practice, a lot of those combinations, some of them are physically unrealizable, but others are just actually not very useful. So I can imagine, putting an elephant in orbit around Saturn. It's just not very useful. It is, in fact, physically possible. And I think actually a number of the things that we are imagining for our future, though they may not sound as absurd as that, are kind of as absurd as that, because they are buying into ways of metabolizing the resources of the planet and ways of human beings interacting that won't have any longevity and will be incredibly expensive. So a grounding cord is basically the idea of something that brings you back into a clear-headed evaluation of the combinations, the permutations of imagination that are actually serviceful for humanity as opposed to just fanciful. And there are things that can be fanciful and serviceful, but the grounding cord is like, well, it just makes sure that it does something useful for us.
And that sounds like a big part of the job that Leigh has brought you in to do for this gig.
Yep, something
You're
like
the
that.
Grounding cord.
Yeah, I think, so my first job was as an astrophysicist, and I think always physicists are pretty grounded, actually. I mean, they get a little heady around string theory and stuff.
Oh, shush.
Oh, okay. I'm not supposed to.
You picked
Not
that
supposed
one
to
out
say
because
that.
that was my master's, so he's just teasing that. Go on.
That's true too, but it's okay. But other than that, like physicists are pretty, in it. They're pretty connected to, well, what would actually make sense and be possible.
Yeah. I think the other thing, sorry if I might add something in here, is the idea of thinking. So Tom talks about how if it were just about technology that was going to change the way that we live and maybe save us from all the suffering and starvation and so on that's happening on the planet, then we would have accomplished some of that through technology already. But one of the things that, do you remember the story that you tell about the being in the truck and talking to your friend about the thinking, and it's our thinking that has to evolve?
Yeah. So basically, a couple different ways to phrase it, but I guess the story you're alluding to is I was in a pickup truck in the cloud forest in Guatemala, working with my friend who's the CEO of a company that's bringing electricity to these remote communities that have never had electricity ever. And, we're driving through the jungle and it takes a while to get anywhere because there really aren't roads, or that you would hardly call them roads. And we're kind of rumbling through, and we have maybe 5 hours before we arrive at the village. So we get to talking, and one of the things that my friend Juan says is, Tom, what if it's too late? Like, what if we just have too many people on Earth and it won't be possible for the Earth to be sustainable with this many people? Like, maybe we could make it if we had half as many people. And almost without thinking, I turned to him and I said, well, Juan, we had half as many people as we do today, like 40 years ago. And if we continue to think the way that we did then, and pretty much the same way that we do now, then even if we had half as many people, in 40 more years, we'd have all the same problems. The issue is not out there, the issue is in here somewhere. And another way that I phrase this idea is humanity always wields technology at the level of consciousness that it's currently operating at. And if you go back to the nuclear example, so like we split the atom, around the turn of the 20th century, and it is possible to go use that technology to basically make infinite, carbon neutral power that would allow the entire planet to be powered. But the consciousness around the turn of the century was the consciousness that was leading into World War I, World War II. So what we decided to do with that same technological capability, the discovery of nuclear power, was we decided to make an arsenal so powerful that we could blow up every person on Earth 3 times over. And it was just an expression of the consciousness that we were at. There was nothing about the physics that made it so that we had to make missiles and bombs instead of infinite, incredibly cheap power. Now, around the turn of the 21st century, we're in that zone as well. We've discovered a lot about silicon-based computing, communications, and so on. And our consciousness right now, it's not necessarily a world war consciousness. There is terrorism and all that sort of thing, and that's its own topic. But we have mostly a commerce-driven consciousness. And if you were to look at some of our biggest moves in artificial intelligence and some of our most advanced computer science research, what we actually use it for and where we put the most talented people in the world, the most talented computer scientists in the world right now are figuring out how to serve you ads. That's what a commerce consciousness does with a technology like digital technology. And a World War I consciousness takes something like splitting the atom and decides to make bombs. So I think that if an AI were to take over the Earth, it probably wouldn't destroy us. It would probably sell us a bunch of stuff we don't need, at least right now. But it really comes to like the more fundamental question, which is, what's the type of consciousness that humanity needs to be able to go use its next set of technological revolutions in a way that can go change and address so many of the problems that we've created for ourselves over the last couple centuries.
And this really gets into where story can play a role, because I say it a little differently. I say that the predominant technologies and ways that we look at the world create the filters through which we perceive the world and process the world. And stories can play a really powerful role in changing that. We've got top-down and bottom-up kind of brain functioning, and the top-down functioning determines how we see things. And that's 98% of the way our brains are functioning. And that's a little tiny bit to come in of the raw information, but it's selected by our filters. So those filters have to change. So that's where this conference comes in, right, Leigh?
Absolutely, absolutely. And actually, like, to talk a little bit about those filters for a moment. I was just looking up on my phone the name of a company that's just been in touch as a result of the push that we've done so far, and they're called Population Media. And what they do is they operate in third world countries to get story out to the masses through radio. And they're very straightforward, simple stories, but they're taking concepts like birth control or making sure that girls get to go to school and so on and so forth as some of these, tipping points that are going to make a big impact on a society as a whole. And they're using the story to help people to understand why it's important so that they change their minds about it. And so they're effectively, through story, changing the filters that people are using to the extent that, for instance, one of the projects they were telling me about in Ethiopia is they polled the men to begin with, on whether they whether they were supportive of females taking higher office in government. And about 33% of them came through and they said, yes, we are supportive of it. The rest were against it, okay? So then they ran this soap opera over the radio with, just very simple kind of storylines. And they had certain things called transition characters, where the characters were making decisions based on having like an angel on their shoulder and a devil on their shoulder, in terms of, different characters who were taking different polarities and different arguments. And then the transition character would decide how they were going to act based on the input from these other two characters. And this proven to be really effective, because they polled the same guys several weeks later after they've been listening to this, and about half the population listens to the radio and listens to these shows, and they found that 66% of them were in favor of women taking higher office after listening to these stories.
Wow, if only that could happen.
Wow, that was my best thought.
Wow, that's like magic.
Yeah.
They put something in the water too.
That was just with story. So imagine what might be possible in terms of all of these filters where Tom's talking about we're using the filters of commerce here. What if we started using some of the filters that you and I have talked about in terms of the universal female paradigm about how we work collectively for the land and in conjunction with nature rather than against it. And if that became our primary narrative and primary reference frame, imagine what might be possible there.
Yeah, and really what Tom described made me think a lot about, I went to a conference in September on sustainable wisdom, which was primarily about learning from indigenous peoples. Because it sounds, Tom, like that's what you're talking about. Rediscovering that kind of wisdom that looks to make decisions based on how they'll affect the next 7 generations.
That's absolutely right. And I think as we think about like a global consciousness, we need to even think beyond that. But for us to start thinking like even 2 generations out, that would be a huge improvement on now. Right now, I think people think maybe 3 to 5 years out, and then they're obsessed with what's happening on social media right now. So if you were to like make a little chart of percentage of time that focuses on different, time scales, then it's really moved in and become very narrow and tight, like a little pinpoint around like a very anxious and frenetic now, as opposed to in the past there was this sensibility of we are of this earth. And even as you get very technological, like you are literally breathing and living the earth. It's becoming you, and you are becoming it all the time. I did a calculation, and it indicated that 7% of your entire body mass is cycled out with the environment every single day. So it means in 14 days, you cycled out equivalent to the entire weight of your body. And each year, 98% of all the atoms in your body cycle out. That means in that time period, all the stuff of the earth became you, and you became it. Now, if you take the illusory story, its own idea, that you are somehow separate than the earth, then this thing, you're going to run into all sorts of problems, because every 14 days, you're becoming the thing that you're polluting. Right? Every year, 98% of the atoms of you came from the thing that you've decided to pollute.
Absolutely.
Oh, sorry.
Well, it's just I'm in the middle of writing a book called "Bottom Up: The Connection Revolution," and one of I say the core conclusion that I developed in working on this book was the idea that we need to develop connection consciousness, which comes from getting into systems theory as opposed to the more Newtonian approach to science, which basically says that everything's connected to everything, and that looks at things in terms of relationships and how things are connected to each other. And so, yeah, everything's connected. We're all connected. There is no separation. That's the illusion.
So I think that systems theory is important in terms of the large scale design. I think in terms of consciousness, the piece that's been missing, because systems theory is also a kind of very heady world where you're looking at different sorts of abstracting concepts that can contain the definition of a system. But I think the thing that's missing is just direct embodied sensibility on connectedness. It's like an embodied skill that we, has kind of been lost, and we need to bring back into the world, whether it's each individual's connection to their own body, whether it's the connection to the food that they eat. And these are like embodied moments. Whether you understand the system fully or not, in a moment of eating, you feel this interchange with the environment around you, whether it's, letting the sun fall on your skin and feeling that in an embodied way, and then recognizing that it's these mechanisms that drive the entire earth. No sun, no anything, no movement of food and energy from the sun through eating, no anything, right? Like life ends pretty darn fast in the absence of these things. And I think on just the personal level, because this also comes back to a lot of personal decisions and not just large scale system design, though you'll need both. But on the personal level, people need to go feel when they're doing something that it's coming out of connection.
And what we learn from indigenous people is a connection to nature, a deep connection to nature, literally being thankful for the trees that are all around us, touching the trees. Literally, they talk to the trees, and it's not a crazy thing to do because the trees are real. And I just did an interview recently with Derek Jensen and his book, The Myth of Human Supremacy, which is brilliant in the way he describes how these other living things have consciousness and intelligence like trees. Trees put out pheromones and other biological elements that connect them to each other and to other parts of nature. And
they communicate to each other through their root systems. They move resources. They, in order to help the ones that are sick or in need, they communicate the possibility of danger to each other. It's like we just have a bias because they don't move around a bunch. So like when a thing starts to move around a bunch, like, you know, a dog or a cat, then we start to ascribe, oh, well, they're kind of like us. But, you know, trees do so many of the things. They create community. I think, you know, you guys were talking a lot about story, and it's probably worth noting that story is the basic organizing mechanism of consciousness. So it's not just that stories are just like, oh, something that you go to entertain yourself, or even something that you build a cultural mythos off of. It's whenever you have too much stimuli, which is all the time. So like in this environment, there's probably like, you know, 8 quadrillion photons entering my eye every second. That's like a lot of input. It's too much for anybody to go make sense of. And really what story does is it's the basic mechanism by which we make any decisions around which one of those, you know, 8 quadrillion photons to pay attention to and keep, and which ones to throw away. So story is very fundamental to the creation of human consciousness. And entertainment's like a great way to get stories out. But like, I think a lot of times we don't necessarily know that we're living a story, even though we always are, and we basically have to, given the complexity of our sensory systems and the complexity of the society that we live in.
Now, I think that our brains evolved to process stories.
Yes, or actually story was the technology that allows our brains to process at this level.
Yeah, it's an operating system.
Absolutely.
Cool. I'm glad we all agree on that, because it means that we're on the right track with the conference.
Yeah, well, let's do that. Let's get back to that. This is the Rob Kall bottom-up show. First time doing it as video. So you can find the radio show part of it, the podcast, at opednews.com/podcasts with an S on the end, or go to iTunes, look at my name, Rob Kall, Kall. So we're talking with Leigh Clarke and Tom Chi about the conference Storytelling for Social Profit. And why don't you take a little time now to tell us more about what it is, how people can get involved, what they can do free, what they pay for. Go for it.
Okay, cool. So basically this is a project to try and find out what are the tipping points that will make a difference in the world, and then how to weave them into stories. So I went about interviewing over the last 7 months peacekeepers on nation building and rebuilding, professional screenwriters and filmmakers, successful indie authors, showmakers, futurists in VR, developmental psychologists, cultural historians, aid workers, people who are creating shifts in education or through education, people who are changing the lives of young offenders using script writing, people also who are making documentaries to make it safer for women in places like India and so on. And we've even had a few philosophers in there. And all of these interviews are available in the summit, which is the free interview series, which is happening between the 23rd and the 29th of January. So to get access to that, all you need to do is go to everythingstory.org/Rob_interview. And that'll take you to the page where Rob's interview will be on the very next page after that, where you can see his thoughts on the bottom-up approach as well. So then after that, after the summit of interviews, we've then got the think tank, which Tom has kindly agreed to be a part of to steer us in the right direction. And we've also got John Truby and Pamela J. Smith, both of whom are story experts. And the discussion is going to be, diving into certain issues such as racism, such as gender inequality, such as violence, and so on and so forth. And we're going to look at what are the ways that we can create a change in these things across the world. And this might get granular at places. It will never be able to cover every single possibility in every piece of geography, but we're going to give it a good go at finding some key threads that are going to be useful to writers. And then anyone who's either interested in making a change or interested in telling a story in whatever media, they're then going to have the tools in the classes afterwards to go take those concepts and weave them into their stories and weave them into the narratives that they're putting out, either through, that whether it's their social enterprise or whether they're writing a film script. And then their job is to go and change the world with it.
All right, so let me kind of get clarification. First is the part where you have a collection of interviews that you've done, and what's the date that those are available?
23rd to the 29th. So you need to go and get subscribed now, and then those will just roll out once you're registered.
And say how to subscribe again.
It's everythingstory.org/Rob_interview.
Okay. And that's going to go for about a week. Then you've got a think tank.
Yes.
with you and John Truby and Pamela J. Smith and Tom Chi. Is that also free?
No, that's a paid one. So after the summit, we invite people to come and pay some money. So it's $197 per person, and they'll get access to the think tank and the classes that we're talking about. And there are also bonuses and resources and stuff in the members area as well. Now, our profits don't go into our pockets. They're going straight to two causes. One is the True Colours Fund, which is their mandate is to help get homeless LGBT youth off the streets. So we've just identified that as an organisation that's creating real tangible change and that we'd like to support. And then the other organisation is a gift of a future, and that's run by Gift of a Future.
Gift of a Future.
Yeah, and that's run by my friend Kate Prinsep, and she's helping to keep girls in Uganda in secondary education, because we've identified that also as another tipping point where when girls stay in education longer, they have fewer children, they're better resourced to take care of their families. They're also educated, and that means that they bring that education back into the community. So there are a lot of them that are going off and want to be doctors and medics, and they want to come back and provide affordable healthcare to their community as well.
Okay, so I want to just keep staying with this project. So there are courses after the think tank. What are involved in the courses? What are in them?
Right. So they're mostly geared towards being able to tell your story. So we've got Stephen Barnes, who's giving a course on racism and how to tackle racism in your story without being on the nose or preachy. John Truby's giving a class on Westworld. So you might have seen Westworld, the kind of Western TV show.
HBO.
Yes, where they put AI into a scenario and then let people go and abuse them. And there are lots of lessons that we can take from this, but there are also lots of story lessons as to how they went about doing this and how they created what is technically termed an epic in storytelling, where you've got this massive canvas of several hours worth of television, and you have to be able to produce plot to run all of these different things. And this is how story is being told in modern day tableaus like Netflix and on channels like HBO. And so if you're going to write something that is compelling and that's going to change people's minds, you have to be able to do it in this kind of format where your characters aren't just black and white, like we were talking about earlier, where you have this transition character and the devil on the shoulder and an angel on the shoulder. When you start looking at these more sophisticated mediums for a more sophisticated audience who are binge watching constantly, you have to do it in a different way. And it has to be all shades of grey and complex characters and lots of plot. So John's going to talk exactly about how to do that. And then we've got Pamela J. Smith, who's going to talk about the mythologies and how to create the new mythologies that we need in order to build the new world. Which
I have to say, I love Pamela. She was a repeat speaker at my StoryCon conference, which I ran for 6 years on the art, science, and application of story.
Yeah.
and Steve was also a regular speaker there, and got to be a good friend. And he's probably the number one black male science fiction writer in America. And he's done some amazing stuff. So you've got really good people. I've never really had any direct contact with John Truby, but he's a legend in his field. So you've got really good people. So, but I like to hone in on phrases. And you're talking tipping point again and again and again. And I know Malcolm Gladwell's book. I've read it a couple times because I think the book I'm working on has some similarities. But what does it mean to you? What is and Tom, for both of you, what does it mean to identify a tipping point, and how do you work with a tipping point?
Tom, Jim, go ahead.
I guess to me, it's just a colloquial phrase that says it's the point where a new dynamic begins to take hold. And I have a phrase that it's rates, not states. So everybody pays attention to the state of the world, but the rates of the world are actually much more interesting because that will tell you what's going to happen.
Rates? I don't understand.
Oh, the rate of how something changes.
Okay.
So,
that's a physics term.
Yeah. So, right now, actually, the state of the world is the best it's going to be environmentally for a long time because the rate of destruction is incredibly high right now. And the rate is what we need to go pay attention to. Most people are like, well, what's going on with the climate right now? What's the state of the climate? It almost doesn't matter, right? If the rate of destruction is very high, then even if you started very healthy right now, even if the state was very healthy right now, you would be in disastrous territory in a short amount of time.
You're talking about parameters.
No, rates are just how much a thing changes over time. So we're going to go put up a huge amount of carbon. Since the year 2000, we put up, almost as much carbon as we did in all of the 20th century. So that's a pretty high rate. And when you think about the rates of things, so look, if you can get the rate to be different, if we were actually improving the planet, even a little bit every single year, then even if we were in a relatively bad condition, you would look forward to things getting better year over year. Right now, people are arguing about the state, but they don't recognize that the state as it is right now is going to be the best it's ever going to be, probably in our lifetimes. So if you analyze the state right now, well, this is the most optimistic viewpoint that you'll ever get. If you analyze,
that's a bleak prospect.
Well, if you analyze the states, if you look at the rates instead, the rate at which we're changing the planet, then yes, that's what you need to go look at primarily. And when I think about tipping points, I think about the tipping points on how rates are working, right? So how do we make it so that the rate of change, now right now the rate of change of carbon output is incredibly high, but we might be able to change something around the rate of innovations that could go address these problems. Because right now, we don't have that many breakthrough innovations in any given year relative to different ways of doing this. But you could imagine, tracking the rate of that, improving that for a decade or two, and then taking the best of those inventions and begin changing the larger rates around.
How does that apply to story?
I think the way that it's connected to story is all these things that I'm talking about are just facts about the world. Story organizes your relationship to those facts. So a person could look at that and just like you said, well, that's a grim prospect, and you can go and fast forward those set of facts into a type of dystopian world where, the lands are flooded and the rich are the only ones that are able to be safe from, the environmental crises and so on and so forth. Or in a different story, you might take those same facts and you might say, really in the last 10 years, there have been a handful of interesting inventions that could change the nature of things. There have been a handful of interesting, kind of awakenings of communities and consciousnesses around what we're doing to the planet that might change some things. And what if our story was about kind of the moving forward of that story? So, yeah, I think this is the question. I'm not a story writer. I'm very curious about what the folks that Laura is bringing to the conference and the other storytellers, the professional storytellers, make of it in terms of how to go communicate this. As a scientist and as an engineer, I'm able to go figure out what the rates are. So, I have a very clear mathematical sensibility on the sort of dangerous area that we're in right now. But how does one construct the narrative that leads to action? I think that is certainly work of the storytellers.
Yeah. Yeah, and there are so many of these dystopian stories that come out almost every week, and all these series on Netflix and what have you. That seems to be the narrative. So I guess one of the challenges is to figure out how to shift it, how to transition it so that it is a more hopeful one. Have any ideas that you're going to be sharing?
Yes, absolutely. So in one of the interviews with a guy called Chris Fox, who is a badass science fiction and fantasy writer out on the indie novelist kind of writing field, he had some great ideas, and he's actually tested this as well, where everyone agrees that there's too much of the dystopia, but people, if audiences love it, Hollywood's going to keep giving it to them, and writers are going to be forced to have to serve up what they want. But whilst we're doing that, we're kind of reprogramming people to think that the world can't work and all is doom and gloom, so why the hell bother? So what Chris started doing was starting off his story in a dystopian world, and then saying, okay, now that we've got these characters established here, and this is the state of affairs, how do we get them to be inventive? How do we get them to build a new community out of the ashes of the destruction that's happened? And some of this is like a lot of the post-apocalyptic stuff that is more negative is all survival, and it's not going to end well because it's post-apocalyptic. But what he's saying is, how do you take a dystopia and then make it into something that's akin to the kind of frames that you and I have been talking about in terms of this getting back to nature and connecting up?
Tom, what you said about rates, it made me think of what's now the best-selling movie out there, Hidden Figures. I don't know if either of you have seen it, but it's about 3 African-American women who are parts of NASA. Right. And one of them played a huge role in the first time an American orbited the planet, John Glenn. And what she had to do was to solve the problem of how to go from an elliptical orbit into an orbit that would take the capsule to a landing. And in a sense, what you're describing is we've got this accelerating rate, and we have to shift it. We have to figure out how to shift it. Now, you've said this is the best it's going to be in our lifetimes right now, because it's just getting worse, basically, right? Yeah. So what we need to do is we need to downshift, decelerate, but then shift into another kind of a path that moves us in a positive direction, right?
Yeah, this is actually the framing idea for all of my work, which is that humanity needs to figure out how to become a net positive to nature.
Amen.
That's the only condition where humanity lasts for a long time. Like pretty much in all other conditions, we'll burn ourselves out in 100, 1,000 years.
How do we do that? We keep going.
It's actually kind of straightforward. There's just a handful of things that constitute the health of nature. So it means that every single year that human beings are in a place, we need to add more topsoil to that place. And that, from the physics perspective, should be very straightforward, because more human beings mean more compostable waste. Instead, most of the places that we drain away topsoil, we drive erosion, we plant in such a way that, or take the plants away in such a way that the topsoil does not stay.
We're extractive.
Right.
The word extractive.
Well, extractive and neglectful. There's a lot of places where we didn't even use it for anything and we destroyed the topsoil. So maybe that's even worse than extractive, because at least you made something of the extractive thing, but neither one is great. So soil, and then every place that human beings live, the air and water should get cleaner every year. Now that's a bit harder on the physics perspective, but it's kind of an imperative for human health. And of all places, China right now is getting very keen to this, because in some of their major cities, like, people need to wear masks every day just to breathe the air. And even then, it's really, really unhealthy. Like, you feel it in China and India. Really, you feel it as like a force of illness in you. But anyway, so clean air, clean water, topsoil, and then the last one is species biodiversity. So in the places, human beings either need to set aside enough places in order to go and support global biodiversity, or in the places where they happen to be, they should create enough space so that species diversity is not dramatically reduced. But if you can take care of those four things, then you're in good shape.
What was the fourth one again?
Is biodiversity.
Biodiversity. Yeah, our connection got lost for a minute, so I wasn't sure I got it. But yeah, okay.
So all four of those things are completely measurable, just like any other goal that we have. Like, a lot of financial derivatives are actually more complicated to think about than the four things I just listed, right? So if we can go make an economy that optimizes around financial derivatives to our own peril, which is what happened in the 2008 crash, then we definitely have the mental capacity and ability to go optimize around simpler metrics like air, water, soil, and diversity.
The challenge is that we have to include and calculate their costs into any business that we do. Anytime there's a project that's developed, those considerations have to be included.
Well, I think the modification is that instead of considering it as a cost, we should look at it as this is the improvement of the source of all things. So, all of our wealth basically comes from the planet. Anything that's around you was either grown or mined. So it was dug out of the earth or it grew out of the earth. There's nothing that you can see around you that wasn't one of those two things, or a combination of the two. So that's where our wealth comes from. Basically, instead of thinking about this as an economic cost, we need to think about it as an investment in our wealth. Like, literally everything that makes humanity work well comes from that source of wealth.
I agree with you, but what about corporations? I mean, they're running the planet right now. I mean, they're not going to think that way. They're not going to look at the investment in the future of the planet, of humanity, of nature. They're going to look at the next quarter, and that's isn't that the challenge?
Oh, absolutely. Now, a couple different things. One is that people often talk about corporations as a monolith, and really, I worked in a lot of corporations and worked with many executive teams, and corporations consist of actual human beings. And I think the tricky thing about corporations is that the moral depth of the human beings in the corporation is actually quite good. The way of structuring those moral people together into the vehicle that is the corporation actually removes their moral depth or lessens it. So really, what we did is we created a legal structure that reduces moral depth. And we don't need to go do that. We can literally just make different laws. We made up the corporation just a couple hundred years ago, really. Like, it was first started with the colonial sea voyages. So that's not really that long. And most of the really caustic, aspects of the corporation, like, corporations are people and they can spend infinite, money on political influence, all that sort of thing. Those are incredibly recent, right? That we're talking about the last like 40 years on those things. So when I think about what's wrong with corporations, I think about we made a set of rules that made moral people less moral. And we put them into effect over the last couple decades. And there was no special superpower that made this. These just a bunch of people, wrote some documents. So really, let's get some lawyers together, write some better documents. Let's go begin making companies off of somewhat better foundations. And you see some of this, like the B Corp movement is an example of kind of usurping the board of directors and operating agreements and changing some of the things so that it has like this kind of external thread beyond the next quarter in the consideration of how the board operates. And of course, the board can fire the CEO. So the board ultimately has power over the corporation in situations where things begin to go wrong. So I don't think that's the final solution, but I'm heartened that that work is beginning to get done. And if you look at the rate of B Corp in corporations, then that's increasing year over year. So the rates are positive. I think there's a lot more legal work to do. Actually, one of my teams did a bunch of experiments on the legal and operating side around the way that corporations are designed in order to try to address exactly this question. Like, is there an alternative set of legal designs that allow for the morality of individuals and communities to come through in the process of corporate organization?
I love that. That sounds great. I think that dovetails with some of the work that is being done in Cleveland, where they're looking at worker co-ops and things like that, creating corporations where they're kind of bottom-up corporations where the workers have ownership. I think that could play an important part in it too.
Absolutely.
So let me just throw in bottom up. We're coming to the end of the interview. I call the show Bottom Up because I believe we're transitioning from a more top down to a more bottom up culture and way of doing business, which is the way that humans existed before civilization. Do you have any thoughts about it? I know I'm just kind of throwing it out at you, but.
Yeah, I was going to say something about that right when you mentioned cooperative ownership. So I think, technology in a way has the potential, at least at this juncture, to have brought everything full circle, right? So there was a point when technology made everything mass production and homogenized, right? You only had a handful of television channels. Everybody had to watch the same thing. You had a couple of big companies that would make most of the stuff that you would buy. So everybody's got the same soap. Everybody's got the same, handful of cars and whatever. Now we're at a point where both the diversity and the level of customization and also the ability to go bring some of that, the production near to the community. I don't think we're at that tipping point of it yet, but the trajectories are such that, maker communities and local communities are finding more ways to serve each other in a bottom-up style. And in which case there actually becomes the possibility of a choice. Like in mass media world, you don't really have a choice. If there becomes enough tools for local production that folks can be like, oh, I could buy, I can support my community by buying this local thing. Or, we just exchange it in a way where I give them some stuff and they give me some stuff. And it's supporting the basic needs, food, shelter, community. Then you have the choice between that or the large scale handing down of things from big corporations. And I don't think that it's going to be a full either or. There's been interesting experiments in permaculture and interesting experiments in alternative currency and so on and so forth that have tried to do an either or. Well, we're just going to cut the cord and be completely different. And a lot of those are fascinating experiments that will inform, elements of what we will become. But I think it's going to be a both and kind of future where there will be a lot more, local capability for us to serve each other and our own needs. And there'll be a number of things that are better served and, by coming from larger scale connection or production.
You just mentioned one phrase that I'm not sure my listeners will recognize: maker culture.
Yeah. So maker culture is basically this, it's this huge movement. I mean, it used to be that there was a handful of people that would become like machinists or that would become computer scientists. And it was such a specialized, distant thing that, without years in a shop or years in front of a terminal, you basically couldn't make this stuff. It's like, oh, can you make this ball? Can you make this cup? Can you make this computer? Most people cannot. Now, maker culture is basically this, it's a movement wherein a lot of these tools of production have come closer to home now. So it is now possible for people to make relatively sophisticated things. You can go cut your own circuit boards on a little desktop CNC machine. You can 3D print, things that used to be only possible through large-scale industrial molds and other manufacturing techniques. So both like the quality of the tools, it's not just your traditional table saw shop tools anymore, and the usability of the tools is changing in such a way that instead of just like maybe 1 in 1,000 people in a community being able to go make anything of sophistication, it's becoming more like 1 in 50 or 1 in 20.
And so what you're basically saying with the maker movement is it's doing for manufacturing and creation of things what the internet has done for the media, really, and taken it away from a very limited number of one-to-many groups like the networks.
Right. So it's getting better and better. So both the quality of the tools and the diversity of tools, and then the production output of the tools and the usability of the tools the rates of those are all trending very well.
Okay, so talking about rates, because we got to wrap up, and I want to give Laura a chance to wrap up too. Is there any place where any website or anything that collects information about rates of different things? That sounds like it would be a cool thing to be able to go to and track.
Next project, Tom.
Yeah.
It makes me think of the Sunlight Foundation, which has built tools that tracks where money comes from. And it would seem that ways with using different API, application program interfaces, to pull in information to look at the way rates would change would be a pretty valuable thing. Tom, last question. How do people find out more about you and find it and see your talks or your work? Tell us your website, anything else that you'd like them to know about.
Yeah, you can just go to my website. It's just my name, tomchi.com, tomchi.com.
Okay. That'll take care of it?
Yeah, there'll be some talks and you want to get connected up. There's all that.
Great. Laura, let's wrap up with you and tell us about how people can check out what you're doing and make things happen with your work.
Awesome. So I think the best place to go is the everythingstory.org/Rob_interview, where they'll also see your interview as well on the back end of that. And then what will happen there is that you'll get registered to see all of these free interviews over the course of the summit. So that's 23rd to the 29th of January. And then you're on the list, so you'll get to hear about everything that's going on, about the follow-up conference, the think tank, the classes, and so on and so forth. So yeah, come join us, enjoy the interviews. And Rob, look, thank you so much for having us on your show. This has just been awesome.
Oh, thank you. It's been great. Really appreciate it. Thank you, Tom.
Yay.
All right.
Thanks, Tom.
Okay.
All right, so I stopped recording.
Cool.
So